make sure you get to your questions too. So you'll probably remember the NAFTA's labor provisions were in a side agreement that came after. So I'm from the George H.W. Bush School of Government and Public Service, and it was that administration that negotiated NAFTA, and then President Bush lost the election in '92 to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton came in and finished the agreement with these side agreements on labor. So all the labor provisions that were in NAFTA kind of moved into these side agreements, and they established a labor secretariat, which was supposed to be in Dallas, which didn't do as much as they had hoped, and just had guiding principles for labor rights. So there wasn't any kind of real enforcement, or they just had these guiding principles. They did provide for technical assistance, capacity building, dispute resolution, and cooperation, but it is important to realize that even though every single U.S. trade agreement since NAFTA, and this is one of the earlier ones in '94, has had labor provisions in them, there hasn't been a single successful case brought to the U.S. That's been successfully resolved on the basis of those labor provisions. So there's been no successful cases of labor provisions being brought from the trade agreements. So that's mainly because this enforceability was a big issue. There were no successful cases brought within the NAFTA framework. There haven't been any successful cases brought under any trade agreement. So that's why people were saying, if we're going to have them in there, we probably should have some enforcement. Let's see if we can make it real this time. And so there was a number of other labor provisions in there. For example, it includes requirements to enforce the International Labor Organization's 1998 Declaration for the Fundamental Principles for Rights at Work. So these are conventions that most countries have signed, establishing kind of basically a minimum floor for how workers are to be treated and their rights to organize in terms of unions. It also requires, in the USMCA, requires governments to take action to promote compliance with their labor laws through inspections and investigations. This is significant because most trade agreements that have labor provisions just say, we agree to enforce our own laws, right? But now this language is much stronger. It's saying now you actually have to do something to promote compliance with your own labor laws and sort of these other international labor standards through inspections and investigations. It's actually saying you can't just say this is a good idea and I'm going to work on that. Like, I'm going to go on a diet, you know what I mean? I'm going to kind of work on my diet. I mean, it doesn't really happen. You actually have to do something specific. It specifically prohibits trade in goods produced with forced labor, so this is another key provision. It also adds commitments to address violence against workers, discrimination, mainly against women. It has migrant worker protections and workplace discrimination, right? So these are all very important. We were talking about this earlier, about the violence against workers is important for a number of reasons, right? Because in many countries of the world, workers who try to organize into unions will get beaten or shot. And those often go without kind of any kind of legal follow-up or prosecution. So they're kind of saying we have to stand up to the violence. Okay. So what are some of these amendments? So then those were in the USMCA, but then the Democrats said, wait, that's still not good enough. So we need to have actually stronger provisions. So the Democrats spent the last year negotiating these amendments to the USMCA to try and make the provisions even stronger. So one of the things that they added was it removed the ability to block dispute settlement panels. So in the USMCA, they said, okay, we're going to resolve disputes by setting up these panels, but they took language from other agreements and that said, yeah, but if one of the parties in the dispute doesn't want to have a panel, they can just say we don't want a panel. And so they took that out because effectively that nullified the agreement. It also sets a presumption that labor violations affect trade and investment. Now, I'm an economist, I'm not a lawyer, but from what I understand of the law, previously, and I knew this from being on the committees or working with stakeholders and coming at it from a policy point of view, is that there was several violations in a number of countries, a number of countries with whom we had trade agreements, and they'd say, here's a blatant violation of labor law. And they'd bring a case to the United States or to the dispute resolution. And the response of whoever was on the other side, the United States government or the parties or whoever it was, not always the U.S. government necessarily, but the other parties would say, yeah, okay, that's a clear violation, but how does it affect trade? Why is it relevant for the trade agreement? And establishing that burden of proof was really difficult. To actually establish that this was a violation of labor law that affected trade became almost impossible. So now they flipped the presumption. So now the presumption is any kind of violation of labor law or these international labor standards are assumed to be affecting trade and investment, and therefore we don't have to establish that type of presumption. It adds a rapid response mechanism that focuses on individual factories, and this is actually part of the most contentious part within Mexico, right? Because this basically had set up a system where if there is a factory that's found to be or alleged to be in violation, now there's going to be inspectors that can go in there, whether they're Mexican or American, and from the United States, it's still being debated somewhat in practice. But the concern in Mexico was that American inspectors would be visiting particular factories in order to evaluate the validity of those claims. And this is obviously something that Mexico has been pushing back a lot on for sovereignty reasons. It adds reporting requirements and a new interagency committee in the U.S. government to try and oversee compliance. And it adds rules to clarify the dispute settlement, forced labor, and violence against workers in terms of the standards for evidence and just to clarify the language. So these are some of the amendments to the USMCA. One of the other things that's really interesting, and I'm working with a lawyer on another paper on this, but she's like, one of the crazy things about this is that, crazy being new and innovative, not wacky necessarily, but some of you might think so, is that this Annex 23A of the USMCA commits Mexico to additional legislative reforms outside the scope of the agreement itself. So Mexico agrees to the agreement and the provisions therein, but this annex actually commits Mexico to changing labor laws in ways that are kind of outside the agreement. So in particular, there were constitutional reforms in 2017, so Mexico had been working on this, but then Mexico did this. So they had done all of these things last year, and then signed in May 1st, included allowing Mexican workers the ability to join a union of their choice. It creates an independent labor court, which they didn't have, and allows Mexican workers to vote for union representatives by secret ballot. Yes, sir.
Are those American unions or Mexican?
No, they're Mexican. It's primarily it's meant to be in Mexico de facto. Yeah, right? Okay. Yeah. So this is the goal was that of the United States government, right, and the Trump administration in particular as well, but was to try and bolster a union culture within Mexico. Obviously, and your comment was good in the discussion we had earlier. The idea you could cast this, one way to interpret this is you're trying to make the conditions for unionization in Mexico more similar to those in the United States.
Yeah, I was thinking more about vehicles in the manufacturing.
No, exactly, in the automobile plants, right? So the UAW might be moving into Mexico and kind of setting up affiliated unions. The UAW is very active in international work. They do want to set up unions that are going to be associated with them. Obviously, it's in their interest to coordinate union activity across borders for solidarity purposes. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can imagine what would happen, yeah. Okay, so, and then I don't really, yeah.
What law is going to apply?
What do you mean?
Mexican law or American law or international law, labor law?
Mexican labor law. So these are all in Mexico, you mean, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, right, so the idea is that Mexico is reforming its own labor laws that will apply to the workers in Mexico that would also cover U.S. plants in Mexico. And we could talk about sort of historically what's been happening. I mean, Mexico's always in their constitution in 1917, right? They actually have requirements that unions are everywhere, but they weren't always independent unions. And
Why
now
about white unions? I mean, they used to be white unions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, with the company.
Yes. There was another hand over, please. Yes, sir.
Yeah, as you mentioned, one of the key issues during the negotiation was the inclusion of the fact of having inspections.
Yes.
Who's going to conduct these inspections? Are these going to be coordinated by the U.S. government, or how are they going to be executed?
Right, and that is part of the debate right now. So I think that the sense I got when I was in Washington was that the United States was trying to figure out a way where the United States would send inspectors essentially to Mexico. Mexico pushed back on that really hard for sovereignty reasons. They don't want foreign inspectors. There are significant funds tied to the US legislation to the US Department of Labor for what we would call technical assistance. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? Technical assistance. And that's something we've been doing for a long time. I mean, with the Central American Free Trade Agreement, there was another paper done by the Inter-American Development Bank that showed that that agreement in particular was incredibly effective at increasing inspections in Central America. And then if you push harder at the data, the agreement also came with millions of dollars for technical assistance. That we gave them money to train them to do labor inspection. You know what I mean? So it wasn't the agreement or was it the funds? But anyway, does that answer your question? I want to make sure you're ahead. Okay, good. Just to talk about which laws are being followed. So these are the key articles in Mexico's federal labor law. And obviously I'm taking this straight from this CRS report, the Congressional Research Service report, which is awesome, which I've been citing the whole time. I don't really want to go through these, but I'm just, if you're interested in these, you know, to know specifically which laws they are, but just, you know, Article 386 is the one that protects the workers' rights to vote for independent unions, you know what I mean? So these are just specifically Mexican labor laws in the Diálogo Oficial.